Monday morning, August 29th, 2005. A woman named Herlinda Anderson is standing on her roof in the lower Ninth Ward, holding onto a chimney with both hands, watching the water climb the walls of her own house. 20 minutes earlier, she was in her kitchen. Now the kitchen doesn't exist. A wall of water pushed through the industrial canal levee so fast that people 2 blocks away heard it before they saw it, a sound one survivor later described as a train that never stopped coming. By the end of that day, 80% of New Orleans would be underwater, not from the hurricane itself, from what happened after it. This is the story of how a Category 3 storm exposed something far more dangerous than wind and rain, a system of walls, decisions, and assumptions that had been failing quietly for decades, waiting for the one day everything would happen at once. The city before the storm, New Orleans in the summer of 2005, was a city that had made peace with living below sea level. Large parts of it sat 6, 7, sometimes 10 feet under the surrounding waterline, kept dry only by a network of levees, floodwalls, and pumps built up over more than a century. People joked about it. Real estate agents mentioned it in passing. It was simply understood, the way people who live near a river understand that the river sometimes rises. The city had roughly 480,000 residents. Many families had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations. The lower Ninth Ward, Gentilly, Lakeview, communities built on the low ground because that's where the land was affordable. And the land was affordable because everyone quietly knew the risk. Above them, elevated sections like the French Quarter and Uptown sat on the higher, older ground the original settlers had chosen for a reason nobody had forgotten, even if no one said it out loud. The city ran on tourism, oil, and shipping. Its port moved more cargo than almost any other in the country. Its culture, music, food, the rhythm of the streets, had been exported worldwide. And its levee system, built and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, had a name locals rarely used but engineers knew well: the Hurricane Protection System. It was designed to hold back a storm surge from what was then called a standard project hurricane. Not the worst storm imaginable, a moderate one. The flaw no one wanted to look at. Here's the part most people didn't know, and the part that mattered most. The levees protecting New Orleans weren't built to withstand a major hurricane. They were built to handle what engineers estimated to be roughly a Category 3 storm, and even that estimate rested on outdated data, some of it decades old. Soil studies beneath sections of the floodwalls had used incomplete information about how the ground would behave under pressure. In some places, the walls were literally sitting in soil that could shift and separate before the water ever reached the top. For years, engineers and geologists had flagged concerns. Reports circulated inside the Army Corps and among local officials about the big one, a direct hit that could overwhelm a city that had grown accustomed to near misses. In 2004, a federal emergency planning exercise called Hurricane Pam modeled exactly this scenario. A major storm striking New Orleans, levees failing, tens of thousands stranded. The exercise predicted the collapse of the system almost precisely. It was filed away. Funding for follow-up work stalled. Budget requests for levee reinforcement were repeatedly reduced or delayed at the federal level, year after year, while the city kept growing into the same low ground. The assumption underneath all of it was simple, and it was wrong, that the levees would hold long enough, that the worst case was unlikely enough not to plan for fully, that there would be time to fix it later. Later kept arriving without becoming now. The warnings start coming in. By Thursday, August 25th, Katrina was a tropical storm crossing Florida, causing flooding, but nothing that suggested what was coming. Then it entered the Gulf of Mexico, and the water there was unusually warm, some of the warmest recorded that time of year. Warm water is fuel for a hurricane. Katrina began to strengthen almost immediately. By Saturday, it had become a Category 3. By early Sunday morning, it had exploded into a Category 5. With sustained winds over 175 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center's language shifted from cautious to blunt. One bulletin warned of damage that could leave areas uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. The director of the center personally called the governors of Louisiana and Mississippi, an almost unheard of step, to make sure the warning wasn't getting lost in the usual bureaucratic layers. New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin issued the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order Sunday morning, less than 24 hours before landfall. It came late, by any real standard, and even then, the order came with a hard truth nobody wanted to say clearly enough, soon enough. Not everyone could leave. Roughly 100,000 residents didn't own cars. Public transportation had been suspended. Buses that could have moved people out sat in low-lying lots, some of which would flood before they were ever used. The Superdome was opened as a shelter of last resort, a phrase that, in hindsight, undersold exactly how bad last resort would turn out to be. The waiting grows. Heavier. Sunday night, the city felt strange in the way cities do, right before something happens. Streets that should have been full were empty. The ones still around, nurses on hospital shifts, prisoners in the parish jail, elderly residents who couldn't manage an evacuation alone, People who simply didn't believe this one would be different from the others waited it out in place. Katrina made landfall early Monday morning near Burris, Louisiana, then again near the Louisiana-Mississippi border, as a strong Category 3 storm. The winds were bad. Roofs peeled off. Trees came down across the region. But for a few hours it looked survivable. People who had lived through Betsy and Camille in previous decades thought they recognized the shape of this one. Then came the water. What actually broke the city? Katrina's storm surge pushed inland along the Gulf Coast with a wall of water that, in some places, reached nearly 30 feet, among the highest ever recorded in U.S. history. In New Orleans, that surge found the weak points in the levee system almost exactly where engineers had quietly worried it might. The flood wall along the 17th Street Canal gave way. So did the wall along the London Avenue Canal. And in the lower Ninth Ward, a barge broke loose and slammed through the Industrial Canal flood wall, opening a breach that sent a surge of water through the neighborhood with enough force to lift houses off their foundations. Within hours, the pumps that were supposed to remove the water couldn't keep up, because many of them had lost power, and some had never been designed for a breach of this size in the first place. Water kept rising through the day. By nightfall Monday, roughly 80% of New Orleans sat under water that, in places, reached 15 feet. The storm had passed. The disaster was only beginning. The people left behind. Inside the Superdome, roughly 20,000 people crowded into a building never designed to house that many for that long. Power failed. The heat became unbearable. Toilets stopped working within the first day. Food and water ran short fast, and no clear plan existed for resupplying a shelter of that size for an extended stay. Across the city, families climbed onto rooftops and waited, some for hours, some for days, for helicopters or boats that came in waves too small for the number of people who needed them. A man named Abdulrahman Zaytoun paddled a second-hand canoe through his flooded neighborhood for days, checking on elderly neighbors trapped in upper floors, bringing them water, before he was later arrested amid the chaos on suspicion of looting. A mistake that took him weeks to untangle, and one that mirrored a wider pattern of confusion and fear, replacing clear judgment across the city. At Memorial Medical Center, staff worked without power or air conditioning in over 100-degree heat, trying to keep patients alive on backup generators that were failing one by one, making decisions no one should have had to make about who could be moved first when the evacuation boats finally arrived. These weren't isolated stories, they were the pattern. A city where the emergency response at nearly every level was arriving too slow, too small, or too late. When the water finally receded, it took nearly 6 weeks to fully drain New Orleans. What the water left behind was a city coated in a thick gray residue of mud, mold, and debris, climbing halfway up the walls of houses that were, in many neighborhoods, simply gone. Foundations with nothing left standing on them. Roughly 800 people died as a direct result of the storm and the flooding across the Gulf Coast, the vast majority in Louisiana. It remains one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history. More than 1 million people were displaced from the region, the largest displacement of Americans since the Dust Bowl. Some never returned. Entire neighborhoods that had existed for generations lost most of their population permanently. The damage came to roughly $125 billion, making Katrina, at the time, the costliest hurricane on record. The Long Shadow, New Orleans, today has fewer residents than it did in 2005. Some neighborhoods, particularly the lower Ninth Ward, never recovered their pre-storm population. Lots that once held homes are now simply empty, reclaimed slowly by grass and trees. The disaster forced a complete reevaluation of how the federal government prepares for and responds to catastrophic events. FEMA's handling of the crisis became a case study in bureaucratic failure taught in emergency management courses for years afterward, not because individual people didn't try, but because the systems meant to coordinate them broke down at nearly every handoff. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually admitted its own design flaws had contributed directly to the flooding, an unusually blunt admission from a federal agency about its own responsibility for a disaster. In the years since, roughly $14.25 billion has been spent rebuilding New Orleans' levee and floodwall system into something far stronger than what existed in 2005. But Katrina also reshaped something less visible: how race and poverty intersected with who got out in time and who didn't, how the country talked about disaster response, and how seriously officials elsewhere started taking their own aging infrastructure. Why this still matters: coastal cities across the world are watching their sea levels rise while their populations keep growing along the coastline, not away from it. The core failure at the heart of Katrina wasn't really about one storm. It was about a gap between what engineers privately understood as risk and what officials publicly acted on as priority. That gap hasn't closed. It's shown up again in other cities, other storms, other floods. The same pattern of warnings filed away, budgets delayed, infrastructure treated as someone else's problem until it becomes everyone's emergency at once. Katrina isn't a story about one bad storm hitting one unlucky city. It's a preview of what happens anywhere that keeps deferring the cost of prevention until the bill comes due all at once with interest. Key takeaways. Infrastructure failures are rarely sudden. They're the final step in a long chain of decisions, made years apart by people who each believed someone else would catch the problem in time. Evacuation plans that don't account for people without cars, money, or mobility aren't real evacuation plans. They're plans for the people who were already going to be fine. The cost of prevention is always smaller than the cost of the disaster it prevents, but prevention rarely has a deadline attached to it, so it keeps losing to things that do. Recovery isn't just rebuilding what was there. Some places and some communities don't come back the same, no matter how much money eventually arrives. Closing Katrina didn't just flood a city. It revealed how much of what protects us depends on decisions made quietly, years in advance, by people counting on being lucky instead of being ready. As one levee engineer close to the case put it afterward, in words that have stayed with people who worked the recovery, the storm didn't defeat us, our own arithmetic did. We simply bet on the wrong number for too many years in a row. New Orleans is still here, rebuilt, scarred, and standing on the same low ground it always stood on. The question the storm left behind was never really about that one city. It was about every other place still making the same quiet bet,